want to like his work. I really want to like his work. But I have a really hard time liking his work. One of the characters was basically a collection of moss. Don't know. Alright guys, for this video we're going to be looking into my DNFs for 2020, which are the books that I did not finish. Could be that I didn't like them, it could be just the length, it could be the subject matter. Some of these books I'm still reading and I'm really enjoying. Some of them I'm rereading and finding out that I didn't like them as much as I thought. That's not necessarily true. We'll get to that book very specifically because it's culturally relevant, particularly for next year because there's a movie coming out about it. To get started, I'm actually going to bring up a book that I actually liked quite a bit this year. The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So I came across this book because of Jordan Peterson. I'm not a fanatic Jordan Peterson fan, but I do like a lot of the things that he talks about. I don't really get too much into his political stuff at all, although this book is kind of the foundation, I feel like, for a lot of his political ideas and his approaches, and you can't really blame him. This is an incredibly powerful book that documents a person's experience and the people that he encounters in the Soviet Russian work camps that were set up all across Russia and made kind of famous during the reign of Stalin, when people were thrown into these work camps for many, many horrendous, really insane, ridiculous reasons that get fleshed out in this book, and they get fleshed out in a way that makes you very careful and terrified of any of the things that might have led up to the consequences in this book, because it is absolutely horrendous. I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically you could get thrown into one of these Russian work camps for 10 years for any reason, including one of my favorite examples of this book, and I'll bring this up again when I do a full review of it, is there is a crowd of people and they were doing some sort of presentation, some sort of Stalin, I don't know, glorification ceremony or whatever, and at the end of it, people stood and started clapping, and then they continued to clap and continued to clap and continued to clap. And the reason why they did this is because nobody wanted to be the first person to sit down, to show that it was being disrespectful towards Stalin. So they all continued clapping. They were clapping for 3 minutes, for 4 minutes, for 10 minutes. Some people were getting exhausted and sweating. And as soon as one person got fed up and sat down, in a wave, all the heads just sunk down into their seats. And then the person who sat down was arrested afterwards. And then the guards laughed and said, never be the first one to stop clapping. Whether that is a tall tale or not, there are many, many examples of things that are just as egregious, if not worse. Put it this way, it's not a light read, it's not a very happy read, and it's a little bit hard to get through the subject material, not because of how it's written, but because it's so bleak. Although there are some messages of hope within it, there's some really deep human behavior stuff that is worth examining, but I'm not doing it at a quick pace. So I didn't finish this year, but I didn't finish it this year because I'm taking my time with it. I really want to absorb it. I'm kind of reading it in between other books that I'm working on at the time. Now for the next one, I don't have a physical copy of this book, but it is Sapiens by Yuval Harari, I believe his name is. And this basically is just a fun way to look at the history of mankind. I don't think the audiobook is the right medium for it. The audiobook was good. It's just, I wasn't that interested. And this is one of those books where I wasn't interested in, but I have nothing bad to say about it. It was just the subject material. I know a lot of people love this book. It's massively popular, and it gives you a really insightful look at kind of the history of human beings and how we've progressed and how we got to where we are today. I had a very strong science background from university, and I did a lot of evolution and a lot of evolutionary psychology. So a lot of this stuff, some of it's like new and nifty, but I feel like I'm going over things that I had to go over in university again. So it's great. If you don't have that kind of background, I think this is a phenomenal book. I know the physical book is probably a little bit better to go through, and I think they even have some sort of comic or picture book variation of it as well, which would be great for younger readers. The next one is another nonfiction. This is going to sound controversial, but I'm going to want you to hear me out for a second. I really hated White Fragility. Can't remember the name of the author, but this year I decided to dig into some race-related books, and I had read two that were absolutely phenomenal. One in particular, which was The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is a 5 out of 5 book that had great historical context and really delved deep into the mechanisms of the systems in place that are kind of perpetuating systemic racism, the kind of machinations of the prison industrial complex, for instance, and how it can cycle people through that systems, and how certain policies are disproportionately targeted towards people of color in impoverished areas as opposed to other groups. White Fragility didn't seem to go into any of those mechanisms. It didn't really point to anything that could help. White Fragility as a title is very clever because it's almost like that witch trial. You know, you throw the witch in the water, and if they float, they're a witch, so you kill them, and if they drowned, that means they weren't a witch, but they die anyway. I don't understand the point of this book. I'm going to be honest. This book, the way it was written, sounds like somebody on one ideological side talking to people on the same ideological side about how to go about it, instead of reaching over across the aisle to the opposition, to people who really need to internalize this message and get them to understand. So if I surprise, surprise, I know a lot of white people, and most of them, if you were to give them something like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, they would be like, oh, holy shit, I didn't know it was this in depth. I didn't know this was going on. That's not right, and we should probably do something about it. Whether they do something about it or not is another story. I'm not saying there's not utility in it. I'm saying I hated the approach. I disliked the writing, and I didn't think it was useful as the other books I read on race, or the books, to be honest with you, the fiction books that I read from authors of color that were so impactful in terms of establishing a connection that made me empathize better with those who I should be listening to, rather than being told by another, I believe the author's white, instead of being told by another white person how I should feel about people of color. So another nonfiction one that might be surprising for me that I did not finish this year, despite having had it for a little while, is Opening Close Guard by Robert Drysdale. So I've made this clear on the channel before that I'm a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. Before COVID-19, that was my career. I hope that it's still my career after COVID-19 passes. And I am a little bit of a nerd when it comes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I love the history. I love how we got to the sport where it is today. And there seems to be a big gap in the knowledge, because most of what we understand from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes from a very few sources. So Robert Drysdale is a black belt who I had the pleasure of attending a few seminars with. I attended his seminars in Hamilton, but he's from the United States. He spent some time in Brazil. He's an OG black belt, very accomplished. He also speaks Portuguese, and he took it upon himself to kind of shoulder the burden of figuring out the true lineage of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the history, where it comes from. And that's what this book is. This book is kind of the precursor to the documentary that is being released of the same name. And this kind of just gives you a sneak peek into a lot of the interviews. It's literally the transcripts of the interviews with an introduction from the author in the beginning of each interview, where he gives you a little bit of backstory and a little bit of context for the person that you're going to be hearing or reading in this interview. The author does insert their own opinion into this story, and they justify that and why they do that, and that's completely fine. It's not super heavy-handed. You can agree or disagree with the author. The author is not imposing any of his ideas onto the interview itself. The person who's being interviewed, it's just purely their words, and you get to pick that apart as you will. I love the insights, but because of the format, because it just kind of bounces from one person to the other, I feel like I don't have to read this all in one sitting. I just finished the interview with Carlos Gracie Jr., who is the president of the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, as well as Gracie Barra, which is another can of worms, which it was an excellent interview, gave some insights into the perspective of the early days of the growth of the sport and what it was like, because for a lot of people in North America, we just don't have that insight. But yeah, it's not that I didn't finish this because I didn't like it. I do enjoy this book, and I can't wait to review it in more depth. It's just that I feel like I can pick up one interview, read it, and then come back to another interview later on in time. And I eagerly await the documentary whenever it comes out. I'll definitely be buying that and watching that as well. Okay, this is the one that's going to anger everybody. Not anger everybody, but this has a very strong fandom has a movie that was supposed to come out this year, but it's coming out next year, and that is Dune. Sorry about the glare. Dune by Frank Herbert. I'm still working out the lighting with this whole thing. Dune is to science fiction almost what Lord of the Rings is to fantasy, and they do make that comparison here. Arthur C. Clarke, who I reviewed on this channel with Childhood's End, he says right on the back, unique, I know nothing comparable to it except Lord of the Rings. So why didn't I like Dune? Long story short, Dune has the worst dialogue I've ever written in any book in my life. I hate the scene construction. The characters are set pieces to move the plot forward. There is way too much backstory crammed into a little thing, and a lot of rumination in a very dry way on details that I don't think matter. Now, there's a lot of redeeming qualities about this book. The concepts are interesting. The story that's happening is great. The way it's told, I hate it. I can't stand it. I read it before, I completed it, and this is actually a reread of it. I'm listening to it right now, and actually listening to it, not having to read through Frank Herbert's punctuation, and not having to try to guess how his characters are talking in my head, because people don't talk like this. And when I say people don't talk like this, I don't mean that they don't talk in flowery language or heightened language. That's completely fine. What I mean is they don't narrate their thoughts in the way that these people narrate their thoughts sometimes. And it's very psychological, but it's heavy-handed in how it's psychological. And I'm listening to it. I don't think I'm going to make it to the end. If I do make it to the end, it's going to be because I forced my way through as a study purpose. That being said, because of the way it's written, I think I'm going to love the movie, because I want to love this book. I want to love Dune. I want to. I tried. I want to so bad that I'm reading it a second time, and it's not helping. It's making me appreciate the things it does well that much better, but it's also making me hate the things it did poorly that much worse. So yeah, Dune might be your cup of tea, but I find that the people who don't like it really don't like it. Next one on the list, guys. This is another author who frustrates me to no end, because I want to like his work. I really want to like his work, but I have a really hard time liking his work, and that is Jeff Vandermeer. This book is Dead Astronauts. So I did read Annihilation, the first book of the Southern Reach trilogy, and I had a few people tell me that they loved it, and I didn't understand why they loved it. His literary style, I believe, is part of something called the New Weird. Another person in that style is China Mieville. I'm so sorry, I can't pronounce that last name. Who I've read two books in a little bit, and he wrote Perdido Street Station, which I loved. He wrote The City in the City, which I thought was okay. And The Scar, which also takes place in the same universe as Perdido Street Station. I just don't really care about kind of pirate on the water sort of stories, so it was really hard for me to connect with that one. Actually, I guess technically that's it. Did not finish from this year as well. I don't know how to explain this book. I like weird stuff, okay? Haruki Murakami is one of my favorite authors ever. The next book that I didn't finish, even though I didn't finish it because it's a short story collection, and I haven't finished every single short story. But the next author I'm about to bring up, I love his work as well, and it's very strange. I like a lot of weird fiction. I write a lot of weird fiction. I like to kind of border that surrealist feel that makes me feel like that, the world we're walking through is a thin veneer for something very interesting behind it, and we can kind of pick apart that weirdness with some interesting stories. I don't know what's happening in this book. There's 3 characters that are like in some cyclical universe. I don't know whether they're being reborn every time. I can't even really remember what the characters were. One of the characters was basically a collection of moss. Don't know. They go to these cities. Every city is kind of the same. Nothing happens. Nothing happens in this book that is clear, that's concrete. There's nothing to ground you, which again is fine. I bought another book that's very much like that, I believe, and it's called Dahlgren by Samuel R. Delaney, and I'm really excited about it. This book is just very abstract. It's very abstract. It's very hard to hold on to. This is probably going to be my last Jeff Vandermeer book, which is a shame. unless I get a really strong recommendation for another one. Again, somebody who I really wanted to love, but just had a really, really super hard time connecting with. And the last one that I'm working my way through right now is Labyrinths by Borges, George Luis Borges. And Borges is hard to explain. I talked about Jeff Vandermeer being kind of weird. Borges is weird too. These short stories are not going to give you like a narrative thread to hold on to. They're going to give you almost linguistic puzzles, and it's almost entirely concept-driven fiction, and concept more in historical, psychological, linguistic sense, more than playing with possibilities that you might get in something like science fiction. It's very hard to explain a lot of these stories. There's one, the Library of Babel, that basically just details an infinite library of everything ever possibly written. We talk about the cyclical nature of time and how historical figures pop up again and again. Bizarre looks at concepts like infinity and how those can manifest in the mind, in linguistics, in people and interactions, how we can create something real from the imaginary. Just very high concept fiction. And the reason why I haven't finished it is not because I haven't read through it. It's because every time I listen to one of these stories, because I did pick up the audio book as well, or I read one of these stories, I tend to want to think about it for a while, because it's a weird thing to hold on to. It's a trip. It's a hard trip. If that's your kind of thing, if you want high literary, I don't even want to say highbrow literary kind of stuff, it's weird. It's weird. It's difficult. If you like intellectual stimulation, Borges is a good place to go. If you're looking for a fun story, Borges is not the place to go. So I very much enjoy this kind of fiction. I enjoy it selectively, so I don't like reading it all the time. I like peppering it in between my fun reads. But yeah, this is one that I didn't finish. I'm enjoying. I've used a lot of these ideas, just not something that I finished this year. So guys, those were the books that I didn't happen to finish all year. I didn't hate all of them. I really only disliked 2 of them. The other ones, there's just one way, for one reason or another, I didn't get to the end of them this year. It doesn't mean I won't finish them. Doesn't mean I won't love them. Doesn't mean that you won't love them either, even the ones that I did hate. So if you guys weren't able to get through any books this year, or you did read the books that I didn't get through, let me know. And if you have any book recommendations for 2021, I'm really excited to get into a new reading list. I'm probably going to start recording videos talking about the books I intend to read over the next month or 2. Next video, guys, is going to be the full list of the books that I read this year, including my absolute favorites and why those are my favorites. So stay tuned for that. If you guys have any more book recommendations, please let me know, and I will catch you guys on the next video.